Across the world, it seems that wherever there is a war, there is the United States.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes.
If Gaddafi does not comply with the resolution, the international community will impose consequences. The resolution will be enforced through military action.
In its 245-year history, the U.S. has only not been at war for 17 years. From the end of World War II to 2001, Americans were at the heart of 81% of the world's conflicts, 201 out of 248 in 153 regions of the world. The mission always has a positive frame, from maintaining justice to humanitarian intervention. But the U.S. has launched or become embroiled in wars at a very high cost. Millions of civilians were killed, and critical infrastructure was crushed, and civilians perished, and at least 350,000 tons of explosive bombs and landmines left a legacy of havoc. In the Kosovo War, the U.S. dominated. NATO bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia for 78 straight days, leaving a trail of destruction. More recently, the 21st century wars in Afghanistan. Almost every U.S. president since World War II has declared or intervened overseas. However, while delivering humanitarian disasters to other countries, the United States has enjoyed a money-spinning business. For many years, wars and preparations for hostilities have been integral to America's prosperity and affluence. Indeed, war is the business of America. The business of oil.
A lot of meetings on foreign policy. You know, for years and generations, wars have been fought over oil.
Oil has been central to many of the interventions in recent decades. The U.S. launched the Gulf War partly to wrest oil resources, seized access to oil resources in Central Asia after going into Afghanistan, and used the Iraq War to consolidate its control over oil resources in the Middle East. U.S. strategic analysts predicted before the war that although the cost of the U.S.-Iraq War would be about $177 billion, the value of Iraq's oil reserves was $3.4 trillion. The business of military industry.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Emerging during World War II, the military-industrial complex gradually became one of the key pillars of the U.S. hegemony. This concentrated economic and military power industry runs for war, feeding a large number of workers and members of Congress along the way. Non-political organizations, such as so-called think tanks, that specialize in lobbying for the interests of other industries. Political entrepreneurs also rely on the system to survive, along with numerous research and development institutions. This has created a political biological chain from the military-industrial complex to voters, then the members of Congress and political entrepreneurs. How has this chain become maintained over 75 years? If there is a war, it must have a stake. If there is no war, it must create one to maintain the military-industrial complex and feed the interests groups waiting for their lucrative scraps.
And that's why you're going to continue to have crisis after crisis, because we have to continue feeding that insufferable giant that will continue to need to be fed.
After World War II, U.S. overseas wars and defense expenditures stimulated economic growth, increased from $20.7 billion in 1905 to $65.1 billion in 1953. The tremendous military demand from the Vietnam War catalyzed the U.S. economic boom. In the 1960s, NATO significantly increased the procurement of material, thereby stimulating the development of the industrialized military establishment. After the September 11 attacks, American economists published an article titled "Prosperity Will Rise Out of the Ashes" in the Wall Street Journal, predicting that the future war on terrorism would bring prosperity back to the United States. Over the 20 years since the war in Afghanistan began, the stocks of American military-industrial giants have soared.
The goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the United States, out of the tax bases of European countries, through Afghanistan and back into the hands of a transnational security elite.
After 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, do you really think that America's attempt to build an image as the guardian of global peace means it cares about winning or losing? What it wants is to fight a war and keep on fighting for its own interests.
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
From 2001 to 2021, the stocks of those top 5 contractors outperformed the stock market overall by 58%. The wars are all about expanding the interests and the power of the U.S. War is the business of America. Conflict and military operations are a hegemonic tool for the United States. Thousands have died in Ukraine, with no end in sight. The U.S. and its allies have pledged millions of dollars in support. Is this a defense of democracy as Washington claims, or blatant war profiteering?
Basically, we're out of money.
The military-industrial complex is the one that benefits from this. They clearly control the Biden administration.
With constant interference in foreign wars, a dire prediction of past U.S. leaders has come true.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
We take a closer look at the military-industrial factor and how it dictates U.S. foreign policy. These weapons can all be found on the battlefield in Ukraine. They're made by American arms companies, and the United States has been providing them to Kyiv since the Russia-Ukraine conflict began in February.
And we are doing everything we can as the United States, working around the clock to deliver our own weapons.
And since the conflict in Ukraine began, these arms producers have been making more money.